Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Gio and Joey Show. We have a special guest for you tonight. We didn't have a program last week. I apologize. I had to do an anointing in Texas and it ran late. Joey, introduce our guest and let's go with this episode I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to this episode. He's got an upcoming book, and I'll let him I'll let him tell about his book. But I was really struck by the topic. I think it because Gio and I we like talking about religious liberty issues. I think this really goes along with that. But our guest is Matthew Boedy. He's the author of the upcoming book of Seven Mountains Mandate about a an element of Christianity that kind of undermines America's democracy. So we wanted to talk to him about that. But first, I'll give the floor to Matthew. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what prompted you to write this book.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm coming to you live from my kitchen here in Gainesville, Georgia. I'm a professor at the University of North Georgia. I'm in the English department, but my specialty is religious rhetoric. The subject of this book is not far from me. But I also want to say one of the reasons I decided to write this book is as a Christian, I am disturbed and appalled and scared for the types of plans that are being laid out there that we would put under the label of Christian nationalism.
Mm,
And I would say the central group in the book, Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, I knew about them and wrote about them for several years, starting in 2018. So I was aware of them. And then when they moved to Christian nationalism, the two streams, if you will, connected there of my research agenda and knowing about them. And
mhm,
frankly, growing up in evangelical world, I knew right away what they were talking about, what they were saying, how they were going to go about it. And to know that a very powerful group like that is doing this thing over here, it felt really dangerous. And I think that we only see that further now that Donald Trump is back in the White House.
mhm. You mentioned the book that's coming up, and for those who want to look it up, it's under his name. It's Seven Mountain Mandate. Let people know exactly what is the Seven Mountain
Yeah.
Mandate.
I like to describe the Seven Mountains Mandate, and some people put the S on mountains. You can go either way there. But
Okay.
the mandate to me is a strategy of Christian nationalism, which succinctly describes a way in which to Christianize America or
Hmm.
make America into a Christian nation. So, as a strategy, it is a way in which to get at the central parts of America. So, the mountains represent the seven cultural institutions that a lot of our nation is built upon. We have family, we have education, we have business, and there's other ones down the line. And so these seven mountains are to be reclaimed or climbed again for Christ. That is how the people who advocate for this strategy describe it. They want to retake these mountains from a demonic or satanic control, a
Hmm.
secular control. And so these seven become really important. And I just want to point out that, there's some people who would talk about one mountain being more important than the other, the mountain of government, for exactly
Hmm.
right. You're going to try to elect people that agree with you, elect Christians in high, powerful places. But these other six mountains are not necessarily less than that. Obviously, government does have a lot of power. But
Hmm.
one of the originators of the seven mountains, or one of the early advocates of it, was Peter Wagner, who was a self-proclaimed apostle, an apostle or prophet. And he said that he wanted to see all the mountains reclaimed at the same time. That was the idea behind this strategy. So there have been groups in the past that have tried one or two of these mountains. We think of, again, the moral majority and Christian
Hmm.
conservatives, groups like that, um, or the Heritage Foundation with government. And so they've really tried education, they tried government. But as I argue in the book, I think that Turning Point USA has made itself to be the indispensable organization for the Seven Mountains Mandate, because now they're putting their $100 million organization into all seven at the same time.
Hmm.
And I think that that's really important. If you haven't heard of Turning Point, you might have heard of Charlie Kirk, the founder and president. He's on Fox News a lot. He has a big Twitter
Hmm.
account. But Turning Point really, most people think of it as a college outreach, a college campus organization, and that is how it started. And Charlie does every semester a tour of college campuses. He's with Texas
Hmm.
A&M most recently. But it has really grown beyond that since the pandemic in 2020. And it's really grown beyond into those 7 areas that they literally pitch to their donors. Here are the 7 areas that we want to go into. So they put a lot of money in content creation and websites and news, and that's the entertainment and media mountains. They have their own educational arm that promotes not just school vouchers, but starting new schools and partnering with church schools. So that's the education mountain, for example. So they have a lot going on, and they're the only organization that I can think of that, again, aims for all 7 of the mountains at the same time.
Okay. So, I had to look this up, and so correct me if it's wrong, but I have listed as the 7 mountains: government, education, media, art and entertainment, religion, family, and business/economy. Would that sum it up?
No, yeah. I mean, there's different titles for different people, but those are generally the 7. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, right? Because this show started from the things we didn't like over the COVID mandate, right?
Okay.
And so we are big proponents of religious liberty. However, we are people of faith. So how do you answer? Because I agree with you. Trying to marry the government and religion is never a good thing. Just look at history. However, I do want to influence people for Christ. So how do you find that balance?
I do want to say that I think some of the early advocates of this strategy, when it was not known as the 7 mountains, this strategy kind of started in the 70s. They really much used the word influence a lot. They wanted to disciple Christians and have those individual Christians go into these areas, or, if you will, convert people already in these areas. I think around the time it became a mountains, and I can get into that story around the 2000s, the idea of influence changed to taking dominion. And that means, of course, taking over, taking charge, ruling over. So it wasn't just about persuasion. And as a professor of rhetoric and a person who hopes to evangelize, right, I'm interested in persuasion and
Yes.
do that. And I think there was a move toward individual influence, whether it's high-powered people or businessmen or people in the street, toward a more collective group activity. That is, the people who want to follow or advocate for the 7 mountains suggest that the church as a whole, not just as a local church, but as a national body, if you will, should take dominion over these mountains. And so they're not just interested. In fact, they don't see themselves as a majority movement. They're not interested in mass evangelism. They see themselves as a minority movement. So when I say they elect people to office who are Christians and agree with them, they're not suggesting that they're going to find thousands of Christians that will then vote for them. They're thinking they're going to rule from a Christian perspective. So when they say Christianize America or make America into a Christian nation, what they mean are the institutions and laws and policies, not necessarily that we have a majority of Christians in the nation. So to your question, to influence, to me, to have your faith in the public square or have your faith in the government means to go out and to argue from faith-based principles, from moral laws, from things like that. But you are arguing to mainly a secular audience. And so you both speak in your own words, but you also want to convince them that what you're doing is good for them. So I suggest that Christian nationalism, as I see it from the Turning Point USA crowd and for the 7 Mountains mandate, it is not about persuasion. It's not about changing people's minds who are secular. It's suggesting that secularism is evil and bad and we should get rid of it. So I don't think there's so much a balance between influence and dominion. I think they're 2 separate attempts to be Christians in America. We see the dominion part coming from a very conservative, charismatic, perhaps even Southern Baptist way. But we also see the influence coming from a bunch of other Christian works and also Southern Baptist. So I would not suggest the 7 Mountains mandate is a majority idea within Christianity, Protestantism at all. But the way they're going about it seems to suggest that they're a minority group and they want it that way. And so they're not interested in influence so much as they're interested in power.
Okay. And okay, good. I like that answer because, I think you would agree to this. So tell me if you don't. But for example, you and I, if I understand you correctly, and the premise of the book, you and I would not mind the whole nation being Christian if it was done by persuasion, right? That they saw our arguments They saw the way we live for Christ, and they naturally converted to that. Whereas this seems to be, we're going to govern by the sword, whether you like it or not, if they get in power.
Right. I do think there's different ways in which they try to do that. The government power is one of them. But to impose their, I don't want to even use the word Christian values, but to impose their idea of Christianity on these institutions is not done by persuasion. So yes, if there's a mass evangelism and a mass revival and we can count individual people and we don't have to ask which Christianity, sure. I mean, there are plenty of places that work like that, maybe in small towns. But the idea is not so much mass evangelism and not a majority democratic movement in that regard.
Yeah, I was arguing with a Christian nationalist on X, and basically, you know, he was like, "Oh, that means you want the heathen to run the land." I was like, "I'm not gonna enforce Christianity by the sword," and he basically said he would, and that's the difference, right?
Right. The heathen, the secular, they're all bad. I mean, again, would you want a city councilman that does his job in a professional manner, or do you want one that's going to rule from an idea of Christianity, but not rule over Christians? And that's really the problem there.
Joey, jump in here.
So as we were talking, a lot of questions were spread on my mind. But one, and I think this is central to this kind of cluster of ideas, you mentioned like charismaticism or the charismatic movement, right? How has kind of the fall of, say, more organized religious groups in America, right? Mainline Protestantism, right? Denominationalism, right? How has that and kind of this more diffuse playing field of American religion, how has that played into this?
I think that's one of the central ways it has played in. If you think about the mountain of religion, so remember, all the mountains are ruled by Satan or demonic forces, and their idea is to reclaim those. But there is a religion mountain, and they're suggesting, of course, that is the church. So the church is run by demonic or satanic forces, and they need to reclaim it or retake that specific mountain. So how did they suggest that that mountain needs to be retaken or reclaimed? One, they suggest Christians aren't doing enough and they don't think they understand how culture influences them. But also B, especially in the early years of the Seven Mountains Mandate, there was a very strong anti-institutional church movement. I mentioned Peter Wagner before. He started this group of network of apostles and prophets called the New Apostolic Reformation, and Matthew Taylor's book on that is great. And this idea was they would specifically not be part of the institutional church because the institutional church did not allow these apostles and prophets to do the work that they needed to do. So it's a loose network of them. So one, they're attacking the institutional church, whether that is Methodist or Baptist or any other thing. And then two, they're suggesting that the Spirit of God is not going to work through denominations in bringing this Seven Mountains agenda forward. So you have crumbling institutions, less powerful institutions, Christians flocking to non-denominational churches that may be part of a loose network. But then you have this idea that there's a spiritual war, spiritual battle going on inside the church. And the people that are claiming victory over that are the people that are getting large amounts of people to come to their church. Just for example, here in Gainesville, Georgia, Turning Point USA recently had a pastor's summit, which they have every year here at Free Chapel, which is pastored by Jensen Franklin, charismatic pastor, but not necessarily associated with one denomination. And he's a very large megachurch. I mean, he has 12 campuses throughout the Southeast and also one in California. So if he is a version of the Seven Mountains Mandate, he is successful because he's not operating within denominational structures, and he's allowing the Spirit to move. So the anti-institutionalism is really key here. And last thing I want to say about it is how then the Seven Mountains Mandate has made inroads into the Southern Baptist Convention, which is, a denomination, but it is ruled by a very grassroots kind of way. You have these meetings every year and you can vote, do things like that. And so they are specifically partnering with, targeting the very hard right conservatives in the Southern Baptist Convention, because those are the people that will what's the best word? Really push the dominion strategy and push the culture war of taking back the culture. So they pick the right audience for that, if you will, religious liberty organization.
Yeah, this is dear to my heart because we are Seventh Day Adventists, Joey and myself, and the Book of Revelation, chapters 13 and 14, talks about this union of trying to force people to worship
Mm,
based on the sword, and for as much as you've written in the book, share with us some of the history of perhaps how in Europe, right,
mm.
when the church had the sword, how that didn't go, and even here in America, right, in the early
Yeah.
before we really colonized. So talk about the dangers of where this is headed for those who may be uninitiated.
I, I for my PhD, wrote several chapters in a book about evil on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So I'm well
Hmm.
aware of that part of the history. I'm not suggesting that the two are the same,
Hmm.
but the idea that the church and the government can come together is the goal of the Seven Mountains Mandate.
Hmm.
And I think also we should point out that advocates of the Seven Mountains Mandate have a very specific and erroneous view of American history. That is, they want to return us to a Christian nation, and not just create one in the future. And they use spurious history, like there was a regiment of Bible believing pastors that went with revolutionary armies, and that all the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Bible believing Christians, which is
Hmm.
a term to suggest evangelicalism, if nothing else. Um, and so they used things like that to suggest that America was a Christian nation. Now, when it stopped being that is unclear, but the idea that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence
Hmm.
and all the state constitutions are somehow moral documents and that God ordained a Christian nation based upon them is their claim. And I want to point out that whatever you think about American history, especially in the colonial times, if we were a Christian nation back then, it was not a very good example of such.
There was
And
persecution.
so there were some things going on there. Roger Williams could talk more
Hmm.
about that. So I just want to point out their history is selective, and it's at times wrong. And they also then, in terms of non-American history, really don't talk about the other examples we could possibly bring up about church and government running together. And I think that is because they see America as a special nation, city on a hill, if you want to use that, God's
Hmm.
chosen nation. And so there really is nothing that America could do wrong if it were a Christian nation. So that
Hmm.
that when it does something wrong, it is not a Christian nation. So we were not a Christian nation in the 60s and the 70s because that's when the Seven Mountains came to be. They did not like what was happening in America during that time.
Yeah, I'm a little older than Joey, so you go back to the moral majority back in the '80s, right, with Reagan and the
Yeah.
appeal to that,
Mhm.
and we see different iterations. What's the connection, if anything, with Project 2025 in this?
I like to say that Project 2025 is one of the Seven Mountains. Project
Hmm.
2025 being a large collection of what we should do or what these people want to do with every federal agency in the federal government, a cabinet agency. It's a very long book if you haven't read it. But the idea is we should reshape government. Now, some of the policies in Project 2025 are not necessarily directly Christian. They've been
Hmm.
proposed by different groups that have, we'll say, allied relationship at the moment, but several of them are long held promises and long held desires of Christian conservative movements. They've been trying to kill the Department of Education since it started, for
Hmm.
example. So Project 2025 is the mountain of government, but also that requires sort of a inverse goal. You have Project 25, which wants to cut government and do all these different things to the federal government to make it smaller. But they also praise and suggest that Donald Trump, as president, is the chosen ruler, not just to make government smaller, but to make it more powerful to
Hmm.
do the Christian agenda. And those two things are, to me, at odds. I don't know how you
Hmm.
could suggest
Yeah, yeah.
government be smaller and also more powerful in one person. Um, but that is what they're saying. So Project
Hmm.
2025 is one of the Seven Mountains, particularly the mountain of government.
You know, Joey and I, real quick, Joey and I did an episode when Trump spoke to Christian broadcast organization. And,
Yeah.
some of the rhetoric there about we're going to give you more power than you've ever had before and all that. Well, look, like I said, you and I would agree that we would love for everybody to truly convert from persuasion to Christ, right? However, there's that thin line of when you want to do it by legislation, by the sword. And so, Project 2025, we did an episode on that too. It does raise some flags. Joey, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to lay something out here, and I want to get your perspective on this. But obviously, Reagan's been mentioned a few times, the moral majority. And at least from my perspective, as someone who I do consider myself a Christian conservative, I do consider myself on the right. I do have strong disagreements certainly with this stuff, and certainly with President Trump. But I guess, at least from my perspective, one of the differences in, say, Reagan's political victory, right, his three-legged stool, economic libertarians, social conservatives, and national security hawks, was the commitment in that movement to rule of law, to the Constitution. I know Francis Schaeffer, who was kind of one of the theological architects of kind of the moral majority, he wrote very much about how there needed to be a separation between church and state, and that while we wanted conservative ends, right, in things, right, involving, maybe the second tablet of the Ten Commandments, the government has no legitimate authority in anything to do with worship. The government's not going to make Christians. So, how would you differentiate between kind of a traditional American conservatism and kind of these more dangerous aspects of the Seven Mountain Mandate, Christian nationalism, these things?
I do think it's a large irony that Francis Schaeffer has been put into the history of the Seven Mountains Mandate. This idea that there was a divine revelation of this list of 7 areas given to 2 people, Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade, and Lauren Cunningham, who was the founder of a group called Youth with a Mission, or YWAM, in August 1975. They then suggested that around the same time that they heard similar ideas from Francis Schaeffer, and having read everything that Francis Schaeffer has written, they have some truth to that. Francis Schaeffer talked about different areas of our culture that were, being downgraded or being changed by secularism. Secular humanism, I think, was his original kind of concept. But as I write in the book, the people now in the Seven Mountains Mandate take Francis Schaeffer and take him in a direction he literally said he did not want to go. Mm-hmm. He personally said, I don't want a theocracy or a theonomy. He was very much interested in apologetics, if you will, and that, again, convincing and persuasion. But the people use him now as a cultural touchstone. Oh, Francis Schaeffer saw it coming, saw what we were doing, and or saw the degradation of our culture, and that's why we're acting. Yeah, you could possibly say that. But at the same time, he, during his lifetime, did not do the same things or act in the same manner as the people that are calling on his name now. He died in 1984, so around the time the moral majority started, and certainly played a role in helping Jerry Falwell change his mind about different things. But I do write about in the chapter on media. Francis Schaeffer did this documentary called "How Then Should We Live," and it was a book and a documentary. But in the video part, he did a whole chapter on media and how media could change narratives, and if you change a couple words in a report, it would change the point of view. And he had a very succinct idea about the power of media, and that is certainly true. So if you take the Seven Mountains Mandate and their idea of the mountain of media, it is not just to create a parallel Christian media structure that we would all watch good stuff and we would ignore the bad stuff. Now they want to use that media arm to mock and belittle and silence what is not that. So a good example of that, of course, is what's happening in the White House press briefing room when you have all these new media people getting all these questions and they're allowed to criticize the people in the room. And I say that also, go back to Francis Schaeffer, is if you think of him as an apologetics person, as a person who wrote theologians, he went up to a point. and very much did not want the church to compromise, and very much hated it when they did, but was not willing to do the same things that people are using his name for now.
You know, if you put it just a little, I know we're talking here, but if you use it in percentage, how much of this movement, because I think it's independent, but some of this is involved. How much of this movement is a pushback, for example, to the last 4 years we saw under Biden, where it was just rampant secularism, you know, this notion of anything goes, open borders, you know, no parental rights. How much of it is a percentage wise? Because it's independent, but how much you would say is a pushback?
You know, I mean, obviously Joe Biden, Catholic president, but at the same time, I think that the Seven Mountains mandate started really doing its thing that people would recognize in the Obama administration. So if you think of Joe Biden as an extension of the Obama administration, and we have much happening there that is clear in terms of I think the story about the IRS and investigating Christian groups. I mean, that is still played on today. So you add then the COVID and the shutting down of the churches. That's just an extension of the Obama era. And I think that the secularism of those two people, Biden and Obama, gets said because their Christianity was different than the Seven Mountains mandate. Now, whether you think their policies were secular or not, they certainly had religious elements in their life. And I think that the Seven Mountains mandate gained a lot of steam during the Obama era. So when Trump came to office and he was elected in his first term with this group very much backing him, they saw him as a person who could do a lot of their agenda. But he wasn't really a good president. He didn't know how to operate. Of course, the pandemic kind of didn't help. But I guess what I'm saying is that the Joe Biden era became an interim. I mean, many people believe in the movement, in the Seven Mountains mandate, that he was not president. There's somebody behind the scenes, and then there's this. So I think that the 2020 election lie and the Joe Biden presidency were just an extension of the first Trump term. So what percentage of it is based upon Biden? I would think very small, because it kind of started in the Obama era. But it really took off in the first Trump administration because people, again, named him. Lance Wallnau was one of the faces, the architects of the Seven Mountains mandate, the person who came up with the metaphor of the mountains. He wrote that initial book on Trump, calling him King Cyrus in 2015, 2016. So it's been an extension since then.
Okay. Joey?
Yeah. So one of the things that's kind of in the background here, right? You're talking about like prophecies, apostles, prophets, these things. What role does this kind of, because like when I read, and I'm just going back here a little bit, like when I read, again, Francis Schaeffer, right? When I read, the people kind of with architects of, Reaganism, these things, like when they talk about Christian influence, they weren't really talking about like prophecies and these things.
No,
But this
no.
Seven Mountain Mandate's very much, I think that has to do with the charismatic nature, seems
Yeah.
very much tied up in this kind of like overt spiritual warfare type stuff. So can you give us
No,
a
yeah.
little bit background on that aspect?
Yeah, I think go back to the influence versus the dominion thing. The dominion thing started with a charismatic idea of a spiritual war, and so these prophets and apostles, and you can kind of decipher, or if you want to delineate between the two, but it's basically people that have either God-given visions or self-made visions of what the future will hold. And so these people were not just predicting events in the future. I write about Jack Van Iffy used to do these newscasts and would talk about how Revelation was being, formed right now, and we would see the coming of the end of the world. And he was basing it upon Scripture. He was not an apostle or a prophet. He was just suggesting these things happen based upon his reading. The apostles or prophets are calling into the future, if you will, and saying this thing is going to happen. And it's only going to happen because God said to me that it was going to happen. So a fine example of this is a guy named Bill Hammond, who was early on in the charismatic world, and he wrote several books about his powers. And so he would go around blessing people and giving people anointing. And one of the personal prophecies he would often give to people is like he would lay their hands on them and pray for them, and he would see some sort of future job opportunity or career for them. Very vague, but
Mm,
close enough that when it happened, he was credited with that
yeah.
thing. So those individual prophecies, those personal prophecies became national. And
Hmm.
so that's where Peter Wagner comes in, and he had develops this network of apostles and prophets, and they start to have visions of both the destruction and degradation of America, but also the coming future of America. There's a guy that Matthew Taylor writes about named Dutch Sheets, and he's on Twitter, it's on X, and basically a bunch of his posts and a bunch of his words are, today America is a Christian nation. We declare it.
Hmm.
Or, we don't have to take dominion. Dominion is already given to us. So it is very much about the future coming to them and happening now, and um, it,
It's
suggesting
almost
that,
like a name it and claim it type.
yes, I mean, the prosperity gospel here in terms of
Mm-hmm.
wealth very much plays a role. And there's a great story about Peter Wagner, who was a Reformed Presbyterian person early on in his days. He was a Fuller Seminary professor. But when he switched, or when he made the move to charismatic into the Seven Mountains thing, there's a great story about all the apostles and prophets who were around him. And they declared that he had a spirit of poverty about him, that he did not wear nice clothes and he did not go out to dinner. And so one particular meeting, they just stuffed a bunch of bills in his pocket and said, "This is our releasing you from the spirit of poverty." And so I don't know how much money he got, but he said he went and had
Yeah.
dinner with it with his wife. But he said that convinced him that this ideas of personal prophecy, that I could be changed or unchained from my spirit of poverty, and that's phrases that prosperity gospel uses. But if you think about poverty and change that to, I don't know, the spirit of dominion activity, right? We can release the nation from that same spirit. That is what the prophets and apostles are saying now. So if you think about the first century prophets and apostles, giving foundations to the church and giving, if you will, visions of that, they're doing the same thing, or they're saying they're doing the same thing with the nation now. The nation has become as important as the church.
Hmm. Yeah, and being from a well, go ahead, Joey.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, right, this very much makes me think of the White House Faith Office, right, being led by, oh, what's
Paula
her name?
White.
Paula
Paula
Yeah,
White.
Paula
Paula
White
White
Kane. Yeah.
Kane.
No, no, yeah.
And one of the things that just an exchange I saw on X recently, there was a pastor, and by the way, it's someone that I've liked, right, some of the stuff he's come out with. I don't think he is attempting to be a radical. Josh Howerton.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things he was posting, he was at the White House, and he was saying about how he was at this faith summit. He was invited there as a pastor. And by the way, I don't necessarily think if as a pastor you're invited, you necessarily should have to say no.
Yeah.
But I think you have to be very careful. Are you being used by the White House to say, hey, we've given influence to these pastors, therefore to curry political favor with evangelicals, right, or with Christians as a voting bloc? Or are you able to use that opportunity to do a biblical method, to be like a Nathan, to say, hey, maybe you should have a little bit more compassion for people being sent to a prison in El Salvador, or whatever the issue is. It could be it could be a lot of things. But like, are you using it to try to influence it for human rights, right? Or are you being used by the administration to curry favor with a voting bloc? That was
Yeah,
just kind of
yeah.
something that I thought of.
I think we know the answer to that. I mean, there was this
Hmm.
Episcopalian bishop that gave a sermon with all the Trump administration in the front row, and look what happened to her. So I don't think that Josh Howerton is going to go to the Oval Office and make that same sort of speech in front of the
He's not
cameras.
going to turn
Uh,
into John the
you know,
Baptist at Herod's
no,
palace.
no. I mean, you have Jensen Franklin, who I mentioned before, right here from Gainesville, Georgia, goes to that same pastor summit in the White House and says that God used an angel to stop the bullet from killing President Trump. And I don't, it's assassination to totally right. But at the same time, I don't think that there was an angel there stopping that bullet. And I think that, yeah, currying favor certainly happens there, but also it is, it's power and grifting and all that and currying favor. But there is a way in which they have described getting close to power as they're bringing their own power, right? We talked about
Hmm.
Paula White Kane. She was one of the first people to mention that Trump was a baby Christian and was converted, and she has a long history with Trump, no doubt. But these people want to bring their own spiritual power to the White House, not necessarily be, used by the power of the White House. So I
Hmm.
think that going to them, they're not so much concerned about being used or not. They want to have their own, um, I don't know, stamp or brand there in the Oval Office, and that's really part of the Seven Mountains mandate. Is these individual charismatic, and I use that in a sort of the small C fashion,
Hmm.
want to show that they have the power of the mandate with them, and that's why these individual kind of networks, these individual people with big brands. I mean, this is how they show themselves that way.
This conversation reminds me of a quote from Ben Franklin, and I'm going to read it. I have it here on my computer, and it's, "When religion is good, it will take care of itself. When it is not able to take care of itself, and God does not see fit to take care of it, so that it has to appeal to the civil power for support, it is evidence to my mind that its cause is a bad one." And you look at scripture, at Jezebel and Ahab, church and state mixture there. You look at over the crucifixion of Jesus, Herod and Pilate became friends when the Bible tells us they were at enmity with one another. You look at Revelation, talk about this mixture of powers looking to force people to worship contrary to scripture. Uh, you look at the Gospel of John that states that there's going to come a time when they kill you thinking that they're doing the will of God. And it pains me that people don't see history repeating itself in groups like this, like Christian nationalism. There's when you mix religion with the sword, it never ends well for those with the sword or those in the religion.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the people in the Seven Mountains Mandate will use the prophet Daniel and his story, both the
Mhm.
education part and the lion's den part, and suggest that Daniel is an example for themselves. That we have
Mhm.
to not be convicted by the culture, not be touched by the culture, and that God will bless us in the end. And I read and listen to several sermons using Daniel as their centerpiece,
Mhm.
and they get the story wrong in one particular aspect is that Daniel was in exile. So if you're going
Mhm.
to use Daniel as your
Yes.
your example, then America has to be the exile place, right? Um, so I mean, there's other examples like that. I mean, if we want to talk about the COVID, let's say early months of COVID, and the churches, some electing to not be open, and
Mhm.
some trying to draw the line between mass groups and individual groups. I think that um, there was a lot of people suggesting that the government was trying to outlaw Christianity or outlaw worship. I
Mhm.
don't think that was the case. A fine example to me is a guy named Rob McCoy. He's a pastor, or was a pastor at a mega church in California. He happens to be Charlie Kirk's personal pastor, the guy that introduced him to the Seven Mountains Mandate. And so
Mhm.
he runs this church. He is also a city councilman in the city in California, in which he has his church. And so the city council passes a law that says you cannot have these mass gatherings. And so what does Rob McCoy do? He opens his church and he has individual people walk into his church to receive communion. I think it was from him every, 30 seconds. So it was two or three people in the room at a time. And they allowed him to do that. But down the road, I forget exactly where John MacArthur, the Protestant, preacher, has his church. Right, they were having mass gatherings. Now he finally did win that lawsuit, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
But the
You did.
two examples are quite different. One person trying to follow the law and also have church, and the other person not. Um, whether or not there was the shutdown was legal or not. Obviously, we have the judge's answer. But I just want to point out that Rob McCoy is a Seven Mountains Mandate person. And
Mhm.
his response to COVID was an individual line of believers walking into the church one at a time.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's what's going to happen, right? And this is where, for myself and my faith tradition, we're so strong about individual liberty of conscience, right? Because in the end, you're going to stand before your maker, you, you one on one, right? We're not going there in groups per se, uh, and so we have to learn how to navigate Be- these pitfalls, because it looks good, it sounds good. Some of us were tired with the Biden era and some of the things they were pushing. However, the devil doesn't care what ditch you fall in, right? If you start going in the other extreme, where you want to control people's conscience and you want to rule by legislation and the sword, that's dangerous ground, very dangerous ground. And history is replete with it, all from Europe to even here in our early colonies.
No, yeah, and I think that for those of you who aren't familiar with Turning Point USA, there is a Turning Point UK and a Turning Point Australia at this point. So they're interested in, shipping off their ideas and very much Christian nationalism ideas to those two other places, and they chose those two other places on purpose for those messages. We think of Christian nationalism, which sort of is a new term in terms of scholarship and naming that. But I remember reading a book by Erwin Lutzer, who was the pastor in Moody Bible Church in Chicago, about Nazi Germany, and like it was I think written in the 90s or something like that. But it was a book of showing exactly how the church became blind to that scenario, that situation, and took on a course in what they did. But it was like. So my point is, 50 years later, he's writing a book about something that we all should have known, or we all should have gotten by then, or we needed to hear again.
Kind of like we
I
look
think
back
yeah,
now at slavery in this nation as Christians,
yeah,
right? Like we should
right.
have known better, but yet people were defending it from scripture.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that, well, the people, of course, attacking slavery and said it was bad was also using scripture. So it is
Yeah, yeah,
also about
yeah.
interpretation of
Uh-huh.
the Bible. And I think that that's really, if we want to try to criticize or try to debunk or at least persuade people against the Seven Mountain Mandate, you really have to get into how they are seeing these different stories in the Bible, and how they're using them wrongly. They have the American history errors, but they
Mm.
also are using different selections of the Bible to go about and do their business. One of the famous verses that they use is, I forget what it might be, it's Matthew or Mark, but the phrase is "occupy till I come."
Mm-hmm.
And that is the key phrase in the Seven Mountains Mandate. And they
Mm.
twist the English word occupy and the Greek word, whatever it comes, it is. But
Mm-hmm.
it is it. I do a little section in the book about it because there's only one interpretation that says this occupation means dominion, and that is the Seven Mountains Mandate. If you read
Mm.
all the other commentaries and all the other English translation, it is be about the Lord's business
Yes,
until I come,
exactly. Mm-hmm.
right? Be about perhaps your own business and be a quiet and peaceful life, or do business while I come. It is occupation in the terms of a nation being occupied by the army of God is not anywhere in any idea except the Seven Mountains Mandate.
Yeah, and that point you brought up about occupy, it's about his father's business. And Jesus
Yeah.
repeatedly just spoke even when confronted by Pilate, right? Because people were just celebrating the Passover and Easter and all that. He said, "Look, if my father didn't want, I wouldn't have been handed over." In other words, I could summon 10,000 angels, but he never. There's another quote I like where it's Ellen White. She writes about how Jesus saw the oppression by the governments all around him, but he didn't address it. Why? Because the change is not in legislation, the change is reaching the heart. If you reach
Mhm.
the heart by persuasion, those things will drop, right? Kind of like when Paul appeals to Philemon about the slave. He's saying, look, I'm returning your slave, but treat him as a brother. And that undermines slavery. So it's a fine line, and people are going to miss it. It's not that you and I are denying that we don't want Christian influence, but we want it by influence and persuasion, by the power of the Holy Spirit, not legislation or the sword.
Mhm. I do think also there's a eschatological, um, I don't know, part of this. Again, growing up in an evangelical world, you often hear the Left Behind version of the end times. That there is going to be massive Christian persecution, and that will lead to a period of tribulation after we all get trumpeted to heaven. And generally after all these violent things, Christ will come back. The Seven Mountains Mandate certainly has a lot of conservative Christians and people who, if you ask them to check a box, would check that as their version of end times. But what they're suggesting, of course, is that persecution or that denouement or that negative, that weakness that Christianity would be facing should not happen. And in fact, we should act against it. And that if you think about, again, how the Seven Mountains Mandate started, it started in the 70s when they saw, the anti-Christian secularism of the 60s. Yeah. They did not want that to continue. So if you think about how it started and then add the spiritual warfare, the spiritual battlefield, and then you add Donald Trump bringing, Christianity back into power, if you want to say that, there's this opposite idea of the Left Behind version of the end times. We could call it the kingdom now, bringing the kingdom and readying it for Christ's return, and America being that kingdom. That is a version of the end times. But there's this energy that is devoted to not just influencing a culture or making it salt and light, and not just keeping it, alive based upon some sort of Christian consensus, but specifically making it ready, making the kingdom ready in physical space for Christ's return. And so there are people outside of the Seven Mountains Mandate that hold to that type of end times idea, but they think it's going to happen supernaturally.
It's funny.
Mandate, does not. Think
it's funny you bring that up, because it just recently, in the last couple of weeks, a lot of chatter of ushering in the millennial kingdom, right? That notion of, we got to get it ready, because when Christ comes, we're going to run that kingdom, and they view it as 1,000 years here on earth. And so they are almost preparing for that. And it is scary, because I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, and I'm paraphrasing, there's nothing scarier than when someone is forcing you to do something because they think it's for your own good. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's the danger, because, somebody denounced me as a heretic because I don't want to rule by the sword. And that's a hill I'm going to die on, because my Lord and Savior has always been about persuasion. If you hear my voice, come. My kingdom is not of this world, right? And so...
you use that metaphor of dying on a hill, but there are, literal people who were burned at the stake for that same that same defiance, right?
Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
One of the core, at least of how I see conservatism and my conservatism, is revolutionary movements are almost always bad, right? The American Revolution, there's a few good ones in there, but generally speaking, revolutionary movements, utopian movements, they fundamentally misunderstand nature, right? So whether that's, the Marxists, right, at the time when the Soviet Union was in dominance, or whether it was the anarchists, at the early 20th century, whatever the movement has been, they fundamentally don't get human nature. And one of the benefits of kind of Christianity generally has been, we do get human nature, Judaism too, right? Kind of the more traditional faiths. But this almost seems like a movement that's more of has more in common with these Marxist or anarchist movements, in the sense that this government isn't working. And I would probably agree that there's ways in which it doesn't work. I just don't trust these revolutionaries' methods of just getting rid of it all and, trust us. I don't trust them. But I guess my next question for you would be, to an ordinary conservative Christian, right? Maybe they're Jewish person, Muslim citizen, whatever, who looks at the state of American society. They do have problems with, say, the progressive left, with the sexual revolution. They don't like those things, but also they don't want to enforce their neighbor's conscience, right? So it's can you make the case to a conservative Christian or religious person for American democracy, constitutionalism, rule of law. Like, why, even when we have problems with our political opponents, why is it in our interest to support these things?
Hmm. You know, I think one thing is the group that described. I wouldn't suggest that they are really heavy into politics already, and I think that's a good sign. I think one of the ways they should act is to de-emphasize the political battle. We have nationalized our politics in such a degree that every single special election of a judge in Wisconsin or a city councilman in a large city brings the focus of the national political battle. And I think if we de-emphasize that, at least to a certain degree, we can get back to being influential in our community and our state, perhaps. So if you have these conservative Christians that want to have an impact beyond their own household, it is not looking at the national level, but working at their individual level, because that is where a lot of the, we'll say, evangelism and persuasion takes place. So, but you did add that you want, the ideas of Christianity to be influential in the political arena. I think that, one of the things about Donald Trump is that, he was not a politician, did not have elected office before this. And I think that we often think about people who are not politicians that are going to change politics. And that's often people from the outside. I'm going to go in and I'm going to change DC. And of course, many people are elected on that agenda. What I'm getting at is we put way too much emphasis on those types of people to change that level, so we don't have to do anything at the local level, because they're going to go change national, and then it's going to come back to us. I mean, that is, to me, one of the hallmarks of Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a congressman or congresswoman from Georgia here, right? I'm going to go destroy DC and make it better for you in Georgia. And I say that because if you are a conservative Christian and you have conservative policies that you want to see into effect, if you want to overturn some of the things that have happened before, you really have to convince enough people that it is good for them in terms of secular belief or secular non-believers, but also good for the nation. So you really have to develop a coalition of people to do that now. And I think that is really difficult for Christians, because I read something in a book. A local church is having a thinking of their next 5 years, and they had a line in their book about, we have to let go of the bitterness of losing our culture. And I want to repeat that. We have to let go of the bitterness of losing our culture. And I think that is what drives people to a national political fight, is that bitterness. And so if you can let that go and just do the things that scriptures talk about, I think it would be better for us and them. At the same time, I don't have an answer beyond making the political battle less. There are 6 other mountains you could influence, I suppose, if you want to say that.
It's funny you mentioned that about that line that you said from the book, because this is going to sound crazy, to some people, but to me, I blame a lot of the ills in America on the church, not the secular, because if the church was loving in a Christ-like way, you wouldn't have these backlashes to the, as I say, to the extreme they have. Granted, Christ was perfect and he was still persecuted and crucified and stuff. But a lot of the ills I place at the church in many ways has been hypocritical. And, and people see that. And so if we would just get back to what I like to call primitive godliness, true surrender to God, then that revival can take place. Nevertheless, there's always going to be bad apples, and there's always that appeal to the sword. If I could just get them right by legislation, they'll behave right. But the law doesn't change people. It never does. Not even in Christianity. Christ changes people.
Yeah. And writing this book helped me see the youth of that idea that is the idea that legislation should change America. That's a pretty new idea in terms of conservative Christianity. That didn't come to be until the 70s and the 80s. Before that, there were other versions of Christianity that did the same thing. But this idea that there should be a Christian conservative political movement really birthed itself as we know it in the 70s and 80s. And I think that we are still living with that series of decisions. And the fruit of that movement has been negative in quite many ways, especially when you look in the second and third generations. And I mentioned generations because I'm suggesting, of course, that Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA is a third generation of the Seven Mountains movement. So it's been going on for 50 years. And he is saying things that they were saying back then, but he's saying it to a new audience, and they don't know what they don't know. They don't know that they're hearing the same thing that was said 50 years ago, apparently, or maybe they do and they just want to hear it. I think that there's a lot we need to do in terms of getting people to understand that movement that started in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, many people are going to ask for Barabbas one more time. It's what it is.
Yeah, I haven't heard him use an example of the Seven Mountains, no doubt.
Yeah. Let me share with the audience. I want to respect your time, so we got about 4 minutes. Share with the audience the name of your book, when it's coming out, where can they find it?
The name of the book is The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy. It's being published by Westminster John Knox Press. It's available at their website, but also at fine online retailers. You can pre-order it now. It won't be in your mailbox until September. The official publication of the debate is September the 30th. But you can order it now through all the different means. You can get 40% off at Westminster John Knox Press website if you order it through them using the special code 7MCAST, the number 7, the letter M, and CAST. That'll get you 40% off the current price of $25. So what is that? I don't know. It'll get you down somewhere in the teens. Yeah.
Yeah. and where, if somebody wanted to follow you, are you active on X? Is that the best place?
Yeah. I'm on Twitter/X at Matthew Boedy, MatthewBoedy. I'm also on Blue Sky under the same name. And if you want to search on the internet, I bet you could find an email address for me from the University of North Georgia.
Okay. And Joey, I'll let you ask the last question and we'll bid our professor goodbye. I mean, I've enjoyed the conversation. I am going to pick up your book. I'll let you know that. Thank you for the 40% discount.
Sure.
I'll go that route.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I would just tell everybody, make sure, you're pre-ordering the book. I know the pre-orders really help with publishing numbers, right, and getting more books. So I would encourage all of our listeners to go ahead and do that. And, maybe consider getting this, right, we have a lot of, I would say probably most of our audience is Christian. And consider, right, if you have a youth group or a weekly prayer meeting, getting this book and discussing it in a small group setting in your church. And before I go to a final question, the other thing I would say is, one thing that I've taken away from this conversation is it's all about influence, right? And what kind of influence you want to have, right? Do you want to have the influence of power, right? Power over? Or do you want to have the influence of our Savior who got down on his knees in the upper room and washed his disciples' feet, right? Well, ultimately, he died, for people have that freedom to choose him and right to be saved. And so, listen, we can try the Seven Mountains Mandate, and I think that's going to lead to a lot of problems and whatnot. Or the other alternative is, we can wash people's feet, right? We can make sure that the hungry in our community have something to eat, right? That single mothers who are considering abortion, right, that they have another option, right? They can go to the church and get help and support, right? Like, these are ways, and then, hearts are open to the gospel, and we don't need the sword, right? And the sword is actually counterproductive. Right. So yeah, I would just encourage people to think about that, to get your book, to discuss it in their churches. My final question is, what would you like the number one thing you'd want to leave everyone with tonight?
I think that the ideas behind Christian nationalism and the Seven Mountains Mandate are a danger to American democracy, but they also are a danger to the American church. It is a danger to evangelism. It is a danger to the church's reputation as promoting biblical justice. It is a danger to um, individuals who want to proclaim their Christianity in the public square, specifically who don't want to be a part of the movement that wants to use the sword. And
Hmm.
I think that if you want to be a Christian in America and you're not a part of the Seven Mountains Mandate and they're promoting themselves in terms of power, you will face that power and it will come for you. And I think that will be dangerous for all of us.
Amen.
Mm.
That's so true, and it's prophetic. Matthew, thank you very much. And once again, mention the book, and we'll sign off.
The Seven Mountains Mandate, exposing the dangerous plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy.
Okay. Until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, be blessed. Matthew, hang on for a second after it goes dark.